Hi, I'm Laura Blaze, editor here at Bookstr, and I am joined by best-selling author Scott Turow, author of over 15 fiction and non-fiction books that have been translated into over 40 languages and have sold 30 million copies worldwide. Thank you so much for joining me, Scott. It's such a pleasure to
Thank,
have you on.
thank you, Laura. Thanks for being willing to have me.
Yeah, anytime. So you're here primarily to talk about your new book, Testimony. But before we get into that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kickstarted your writing career, because it wasn't always your primary career path, was it?
No, actually, it was my primary career path,
Oh,
and I took a detour after several years as a writing fellow and then a teacher at Stanford University. And because I didn't want to end up in academic English, I decided to go to law school. And certainly going to law school was the great break of my literary career. It gave me a subject to write about that for which I felt real passion. And fortunately for me, it was at the time that Americans and other people in the Western world were beginning to have this intense interest in the law.
amazing. And so were you writing about the law kind of long before you were studying it?
Uh, I didn't realize that I was doing that, but I wrote a novel that went unpublished. It was about a rent strike, and the plot hinged on something called the implied warranty of habitability, which, as 23 publishers were soon to inform me, the implied warranty of habitability is not the stuff of bestsellerdom. But even though the book, I guess, was boring, to them, it was exciting to me because this really was the first time I'd ever studied something about the law in depth. And that really was what clued me to the fact that I really was, very interested in law. Not something I had really known before.
Absolutely. And so your new book is Testimony. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Uh, Testimony is about an American former prosecutor who goes to The Hague in the Netherlands and the International Criminal Court there to investigate the alleged massacre of 400 Roma gypsies at the end of the Bosnian War. It's a war crime that has gone uninvestigated for more than a decade, and he's recruited to do that. And that sets him off on both that investigation and a personal meditation.
Absolutely. And so, did you find in your kind of legal career that there were many cases that inspired your novels, or did you sort of keep them separate then?
Well, you deal with ethical rules as a lawyer, and
Mm.
basically you can't exploit your relationship with a client in uh, in ways other than being the lawyer. And so I've always had to keep some distance between my actual cases and what I'm writing about. But
Mm.
obviously, the milieu of the law, having practiced on as both a defense lawyer and a prosecutor for an awful long time now, inspires me. And there are always incidents that come out of my practice that filter into the novels. I don't take cases whole and incorporate them.
Yeah. No, obviously, yeah, I can see why you wouldn't do that. But your career has led you to almost 15 books, I believe. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your writing routine, kind of what your daily routine is like.
Well, I'm like um, I'm like a lot of writers, especially as the years go on. When I was a young person, I could write all night, but I've found as I've gotten older that if I do that, I don't sleep. So instead, I get up usually with sunup, make a pot of coffee. Sometimes I look at the papers if I can stand it, given the nature of the news here.
Yeah.
And then I start to write, and I will write, and usually till around lunchtime. Then I'll visit with my assistants who have offices here in the house where my office is, and then I will go back to work for a couple of hours.
Very good. Yeah, I know our audience are always very intrigued by authors' writing routines. They're always so different from each other. So
They
it's
are.
always, yeah, yeah, it's always good to hear. So you've had 4 movie adaptations of your books. Were you particularly involved in any of the productions, or how did that go for you?
Well, I've always been treated nicely, and the people who have bought the rights to make these films act as if they're interested in what I think, and sometimes they actually are. But for the most part, the job of a movie maker is to get the studio's money back, and if that involves making wholesale changes to the novel, they will do it. I sold one of my books, Personal Injuries, to Dustin Hoffman. And Dustin, I met him. We actually had dinner together. He told me he wanted to make a movie that I loved. And then he called me about 2 weeks later and he said, well, just one thing, we're going to change the ending. Because they thought that the ending was a downer, and I knew better at that point than to argue with him, because that was sort of studio and producer's guidance. So,
Yeah.
as I said, everybody's been very nice. I've made some friendships that have lasted for decades, but I never lose track of the fact that their goal is not to represent my book. Their goal is to tell their own story in their own medium.
Yes, you can't take things too personally, I suppose. Are there any books of yours that you would actually like to see adapted?
I think the book that have always puzzled me because it got very, very close, but never actually got bought, is a book I wrote called Ordinary Heroes, which is about, it's based sort of loosely on my father's own experiences during World War II. And there was just keen interest in it. But ultimately, the many different studios that were asked to finance the purchase all said the same thing, which is women don't go to war movies. And therefore it's not, they don't think it's worth the big investment. And when you're making a movie, you're making a big investment. But I still think it'd be a great film for somebody. The other one, of course, is the one that Dustin bought, Personal Injuries, which by now is in turnaround or reversion, as they call it in Hollywood. And again, that's about a lawyer who's working undercover for the government in an investigation of corrupt judges. And that, too, I think would make a really great film. And indeed, Dustin thought that, but he could never, as he put it, crack the code to get a decent screenplay.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed, absolutely. So have there been any books throughout your writing career that have inspired you or kind of kept you going or given you new ideas?
Well, I don't think, generally speaking, I've freely lifted from any literary source.
Oh,
but,
no.
I would say in terms of overall impact and craft, nothing has struck me as more perfect than the novels of Graham Greene. who um, was both a literary author and also a author of, keen suspense, who had just deep, deep revelation of character in his books at the same time that they were often breathtaking. So if you want to talk about somebody who's often struck me as the ideal, I would say Graham Greene.
Absolutely. And do you tend to read kind of within the genre you write in, or do you read kind of more widely?
I read both in the genre and most of my reading is sort of serious contemporary, sort of so-called literary fiction. But that's not exclusive. So like the last two books I've finished in the last 3 weeks would be Tayari Jones's An American Marriage, which I think would be regarded as a sort of literary book about, but an interesting book about sort of, middle to upper middle class African Americans. And then I read A.J. Finn's The Woman in the Window, which I have to say has one of the greatest twist endings since Presumed Innocent. So.
Excellent. We'll definitely have to check it out. And I think the movie of The Woman in the Window is coming out soon with Amy Adams in it as well, which I'm very excited for. So you've written both fiction and non-fiction books. I was hoping you could talk a little bit just about how you find like kind of the difference between writing fiction and non-fiction, and if there's one you prefer.
Well, I mean, for some reason I was sitting around this morning because I'm nearing the second draft, the end of a second draft of a new book, and I was thinking about the intensity of what's involved in writing a novel, and to say that you're aware of every word is only a small overstatement. And sort of the grandness of the project is incredibly consuming. But I have written nonfiction. These days, most of the nonfiction writing I do is opinion pieces. I write a lot for Vanity Fair. And it's a relief. And to some extent, the opinion stuff engages the lawyer side of my personality. Usually I'm writing, my take on contemporary legal issues. And indeed, that's what my nonfiction's always been. And I like doing it. I like both. And it's a blessed life, frankly, to be able to do all of the things I've done.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so do you feel like your writing has changed over the years as well? Like, can you kind of chart a progression through your career, or do you think you've kind of generally held sort of the similar interests? And
I talked before, Laura, about going to law school, realizing that I was incredibly curious about the law, and oddly, that fascination is held. As time goes on and you practice, obviously you see the law in a different way. Something like the implied warranty of habitability, which was a new doctrine in American law, you begin to recognize that it's sort of just part of the endless wave of legal changes that always come. But I still think the basic process of the law, trying to make life just a little bit fairer, the little bit of life that can actually be controlled, is a very worthy project. And and I love thinking and writing about it. So that much has remained a constant. As a novelist, I think I use fewer 4 and 5 syllable words. Anything with a Greek or Latin root I treat as suspect. I like the the book that I am writing now, mostly because I just relaxed into the voice of it. This book is called The Last Trial. It's about an 85-year-old lawyer who's literally trying his last case. And but I found the voice, which is a different, a little bit different, but it works. And that feeling of I've got a voice and the voice captures a world is obviously, a very satisfying one for any writer.
Yeah, I can imagine. Absolutely. So we're going to start taking some questions from the audience now. So if you're watching, make sure that you put your questions in the comments, any questions you might have for Scott. So the first one is, Becky asks, do you have a favorite book out of all the books you've written?
Well, Becky, whenever people ask me that, I ask them if they have children and to share with me which of their children is their favorite child. And usually people will recoil, and in the rare cases where there actually is an answer, they don't want to say it out loud. At this stage in my life, I would admit that as I look back on some books, I like some more than others. But there's something in every book that deeply pleases me, and also something that makes me feel like if I had another crack at it, I wouldn't do it exactly the same way. And I don't know what would happen if I ever wrote a book I thought was absolutely perfect. Maybe I'd be done, but that hasn't been the case yet. So, but overall, when I reread my books, and I don't do it all that often, but usually I'm pretty pleased with myself, to be honest, just in the sense that, I've gotten what I have to give on the page.
Great. And the next one is, it's actually a comment rather than a question. It just says, Scott Turow, awesome author. And that's from Rashad. So thank you, Rashad.
Yeah, Rashad, it's people like you who make my day. So thank you.
Thank you, Rashad. So more of those comments, people. Sage says, are there any non-book related projects coming up for you in the future?
Non-book related projects. If that means film, then 1L, which was the first book I wrote and published more than 40 years ago about being a law student, has been optioned by Freeform TV, one of the Disney cable networks. And so we're in the process now of writing a pilot script, we being Jill Avenatti, really fine young screenwriter, with me looking over her shoulder and making comments. So that's ongoing. In the law, there's always a little something going on, and usually I have one or two pro bono cases percolating, and that's true right now.
Great. Well, that's very exciting. All of it. That's great. So Matt says, okay, so you've talked a little bit about movie adaptations of your books already, but Matt is wondering, how does it feel to have your books made into movies? Any criticisms you have? So I suppose you talked a little bit about that already, like, movie makers are out to make their movie, not your book.
Well, it's still, a few years ago, I wrote a sequel to Presumed Innocent called Innocent, and it was filmed for TV, for the TNT network, actually. And I remember I was up in Vancouver, Canada, where it was filmed, and I suddenly looked around. There were probably 200 people on the set working, and I realized, all of these people are trying to make real something that, for a long period of time existed only inside your head. And that's a very neat feeling. So, to the extent that the filmmaking process, if it's based on one of your books, involves that sort of huge magnification of something that was strictly inside your cranium, it's a lot of fun. And if you can take it that way, it's going to stay fun. Too many authors get too committed to making sure that every little piece of what they created is preserved. And years ago on the set of Presumed Innocent, I met Brian Dennehy, the wonderful actor who remains a good friend. And Brian said to me, you know, you got to accept that we can't film every minute of your book. You know, we've only got 2 hours if we're lucky. And the best movie adaptation of a novel is going to be an abridgment, just like the Reader's Digest abridgments. And so you have to recognize that, you know, not everything you love about your book is going to be saved, even in a faithful adaptation.
Absolutely. So Raghavan says, Raghavan here, do you dedicate a certain time of your day to write, or do you write when you feel the urge to say something? So I suppose you said you kind of have your writing routine per day, but does the mood ever take you then when you're off doing something else?
Yes, quite often. And, you know, as I said, I like to write in the morning and then continue as long as momentum takes me. But there's plenty of time when I'm sitting around in the evening talking with my wife, where I'll suddenly get an idea and I'll disappear for a second to go upstairs and write it down. You know, and a lot of the sort of fence mending takes place in those moments when you go, oh, wait a minute, you know, but wouldn't he want to know if what the other person is saying is true? Wouldn't he worry about that after the fact? So a lot of that is sort of what I would call off-duty thinking. And, you know, and I'll try to make sure I write it down so I can deal with it in the morning.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to keep note of all that.
Right. And if that's my Raghavan, my friend Raghavan, I'll see you soon, man. So.
Do you have a release date for Last Trial?
I'm right now. Grand Central is saying The Last Trial will be out in the spring of 2020, and whether that means February or June, I don't really know. So when I turn in this draft, which won't be that long now, I think my editor, Ben Sabir, will give me an idea of what happens next.
Very good. And I think you are the first author we've ever had on Bookstr who has graced Time magazine. So it's a very big honor for us.
It was a big honor for me when it happened. But.
No, it's our achievement. Yeah, no, it's amazing. Actually, yeah, I'm sure our audience would love to hear a little bit about that. If you'd like to tell us about that experience.
You know, when you're as lucky as I have been, and to have books sell, you know, 30 million copies around the world, or whatever the number is, there are a lot of very smart people who have helped you do that. And I've always regarded the cover of Time magazine as being principally the achievement of Helen Atwan, who at that point was the marketing director at the publicity director at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and has long been the publisher of Beacon Press. And so, you know, as I said, it was a great moment for me. I was labeled as the bard of the litigious age, but the only part of all of this that is always painful is when you're dealing with magazine photographers, they almost never feel that they have taken enough shots. And so you, the author, all of a sudden are turned into a piece of meat and just an object that they want to photograph. And as much as I like the photographer who took that cover shot for Time, I recall being on a bridge over the Chicago River in downtown Chicago, and it's about 10 o'clock at night. We'd all been at it since early in the morning, and I just looked at her. I said, "Theo, I'm done," and walked away.
It's very understandable. It's such an amazing experience, though. It's great to hear about it. So Amy is wondering, what is your role writing for Vanity Fair?
Basically, if I'm inspired to write something, I'll check with my contact and editor there, David Friend, and I'll say, okay, I've got an idea for an op-ed, and do you think you'd be interested in this? He runs it up the flagpole, and if people are interested in it, then I write. The problem, quote unquote, with doing that is you then have put yourself on a deadline, and things have to get turned around in a matter of hours. So you've got to produce the piece. It's got to be edited. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You could be meeting with the Pope, but you've got to be able to reread the copy. So I don't like to do it on a weekly basis just because everything gets put on hold while I'm doing it. But, right now I'm contemplating writing something about the part of the Mueller report that hasn't been talked about, which is the so-called collusion conspiracy part of the report. And I don't, looking at it as a criminal lawyer, I see things that I think most journalists have reported on. So I may take a whack at that piece pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be so fascinating to get your perspective on it. And speaking of which, Tom says, what is the craziest trial or case that you've witnessed?
Wow.
Or, I guess, been a part of?
I had a couple of really memorable experiences when I was an intern in the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. And I was sort of the janitor on a couple of murder prosecutions. I worked for a good prosecutor there named Phil Beauchesne, who was murder prosecutor. And in one of those cases, the defendant was charged with shooting somebody who was beating up someone else, and he described the victim of the shooting and the person who'd been being beaten up, and the person who'd been being beaten up had actually never been found, but he had a very distinct description of him. And as the lawyers were giving closing argument, into the back of the courtroom walks a guy who looks exactly like this beating victim, and I'm kind of breathless. And first I tell the prosecutor, who's uninterested, and then I feel like, well, I'm kind of ethically obliged to tell the defense lawyer too. And I think this whole case has been upended by the rediscovery of a critical witness. And the defense lawyer says, "Oh, that's bullshit." Says it's one of the defendant's friends who's trying to scam the jury and wants them to think that, that this missing witness has been found. So that was, I was quite distracted by it. I imagine the jurors were too. Didn't matter. They convicted the guy anyway.
That is crazy.
He had shot this man, the guy who was doing the beating. He had shot him 5 or 6 times, including once through the privates. And as the judge told him, if he had pulled the trigger just once, he wouldn't have been in court. But the obvious intentional violence of the shooting ended up with him getting convicted of, I think it was second-degree homicide.
Wow. That is crazy. What a good answer to that question. I think that my screen may have blacked out a little bit, but I'm just going to continue on because I think that you can hear me.
I see you. Oh, I see you.
Yeah, okay. Oh, I'm back now. Okay, hello. All right. So Jackie says, who are some of your favorite all-time authors? Are there any up-and-comers you like?
Oh, wow. Good question. I mean, I like, I've already mentioned Graham Greene. As a Chicagoan, I always loved Saul Bellow. My appreciation for Dickens has deepened as the years have gone on. Among contemporary authors, I love Cormac McCarthy and Ian McEwan. Up-and-comers, Lauren Groff.
Oh, I love her.
So, but you know, I always hate being asked these questions because I'll come up with one name, and then as soon as we're offline, I'll think of 6 others. So, but you know, I tend to read a lot, and I read with appreciation.
That's great. So we're actually just coming up to the end of our time. But where can we find you on? Oh yeah. Oh yes.
Jean Kwok. Jean Kwok. So.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. We'll add her to the list. Brilliant. So yeah, where can we find you online, Scott?
I'm not positive what the answer to that question is, Laura. If you're asking for my Twitter handle, it's @ScottTurow. Obviously, I have a Facebook page, and my own page is scott@scottturow.com.
Brilliant. And don't forget, if you're watching, to enter our brilliant Scott Turow giveaway, which we have linked in the comments, and win all sorts of wonderful Scott Turow legal prizes and brilliant copies of all of his books as well. So Scott, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Laura, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Anytime.